One of my favorite games of 2019 was definitely the Resident Evil 2 remake. Taking a classic game and reimagining it for the modern era was an absolutely brilliant idea, and Capcom absolutely knocked it out of the park. So when it was announced that Resident Evil 3 would be getting the same treatment as Resident Evil 2, a lot of people, myself included, were very excited for this. I ended up getting a review copy of Resident Evil 3 Remake, and well, it's not quite as good as Resident Evil 2, let's just say. What's up guys, I'm RGT85. If this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. But without any further ado, let's talk about the Resident Evil 3 remake and what's right and maybe what's wrong with it. Resident Evil 3 takes place during the same time frame as Resident Evil 2 does. You play as Jill Valentine from the first game, and Raccoon City is in shambles due to the T-Virus outbreak. While trying to flee from your apartment, you are met by the new T-Virus bioweapon, Nemesis, a huge brooding creature whose mission is to remove the members of the STARS team, and Jill quickly becomes the main target. Jill then meets up with a group known as the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, a group that is trying to evacuate civilians from the city via a train system. Jill ends up working with them after a chance encounter, and you meet Carlos, who is essentially the second character in the game. Of course, you could pretty much determine the rest of the plot. You gotta take down Nemesis, stop whatever is infiltrating the city with the T-Virus, and make it out alive. One thing I really like about Resident Evil 3 is how they humanize the characters much more so than in the previous games. Even in the Resident Evil 2 remake, Leon and Claire still felt a bit stiff in terms of personality and in dialogue, whereas in this game the relationship between Jill and Carlos feels a lot more natural and reactionary as to how people would be in a situation with a massive virus outbreak and a huge bioweapon trying to kill you, along with hordes of zombies. The first thing you notice about Resident Evil 3 is the presentation, and honestly, it is spectacular. The RE engine that was used in Resident Evil 2 was phenomenal, but I feel like they refined most of the elements of it for this game. The cutscenes and the in-game action blend seamlessly, and everything just looks stunning. Character facial animations are top-notch and full of expression, zombies look terrifying and decaying, and the set pieces you encounter along the way are all great. Nemesis has been visually redone for the remake and still retains the classic look, but it's much more detailed than in the original game, and it's just creepy and terrifying to look at. As I mentioned, the set pieces of the game look great, and a lot of that comes down to the lighting used in the game. Things like fire really make environments stand out, and the lighting system is very accurate and indicative of real-world lighting. The frame rate stays mostly smooth throughout as well, even during big zombie or hunter attacks, and the game is honestly just a visual treat to soak in, with some pretty creative places you visit in the game as well. If you aren't familiar with the original Resident Evil 3 in terms of gameplay, it's definitely a lot more action-orientated than the original Resident Evil 2, and this translates to the remakes of the games as well. Whereas in other Resident Evil games, when you clear out a group of zombies in a set area, that's pretty much it, Resident Evil 3 has a few open areas that you revisit in the game, which zombies end up repopulating an area after clearing them. Since there's much more of an emphasis on action, Jill has the ability to dodge incoming attacks. Pressing the dodge button at the right time will give you a speed burst to get out of hairy situations, and sometimes running away from a group of zombies instead of trying to get into a firefight with them is the best course of action. Ammo is pretty plentiful throughout, so you can be a bit more loose if you want to though. One of the main things that made Resident Evil 3 unique over the other Resident Evil 2 games in the series was the fact that in those games you played as two different characters in the story mode. Resident Evil 1 of course had Chris and Jill, Resident Evil 2 had Leon and Claire. Now the aforementioned Carlos is playable at times during the story, but doesn't have his own story missions, it's all blended into one. Carlos doesn't have a dodge move like Jill, instead he has a punch to help him out of situations. Carlos also feels a bit more action orientated in the gameplay because he has an assault rifle at the start. No matter which character you're playing as though, everything feels good and very similar to Resident Evil 2. Gunplay is rather tight, movement through areas is easy enough, and everything just feels very responsive from the menu system to controlling your characters. Now obviously there is a greater emphasis on action than in the previous games, which for better or worse does impact the puzzle system in the game. Puzzles are few and far between, and very simple to solve even when pressed with one. And personally, I would have liked to have seen some more puzzles in the game to sort of break up the pacing a bit, but I'm sure fans of more action-oriented games will enjoy that change. So the game looks great, it plays great, it sounds great, it seems like this is going to be yet another winner for Capcom, right? Well, not exactly. Let's talk about some of the downsides of the Resident Evil 3 remake. Like I mentioned before, this game is obviously using the same RE engine that Resident Evil 2 did, but I noticed there are several things removed from it. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, you could board up windows to slow down enemies from coming in, which isn't featured in Resident Evil 3. Also in Resident Evil 2, when you were grabbed, you could use your knife in a pinch to stab an enemy in the head, but once again, this feature isn't in Resident Evil 3. Now obviously it is a bit of a faster paced game than Resident Evil 2, but it seems weird to have removed these things from the game, which I think would have worked well. Another thing I noticed is that while I feel the game as a whole looks better than Resident Evil 2, zombie dismemberment seems to be cut down in Resident Evil 3 as far as taking out individual limbs in combat. Now obviously these aren't major issues, but they are somewhat questionable decisions considering it feels like they had to remove these facets instead of just having to keep them in. A bigger issue though with the game is definitely with Nemesis. Now I love the idea of Nemesis and how he operates, the fear of him bursting through a wall and then you run for your life. But something I noticed is that he's not really prevalent in the game like you would think he would be. In the start of the game he makes his presence felt, but there's large chunks of the game where you almost forget that he exists entirely, which is strange. Also, another thing I was hopeful for with Nemesis was that he would show up randomly, but it's definitely not that way. He only shows up at certain times in certain segments, which kinda takes away from some of the fear and tension. And honestly, I feel like Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake was a better Nemesis than Nemesis is in Resident Evil 3. The main issues stem from the core game itself though, and they honestly cannot be denied. To be frank, Resident Evil 3 Remake is a very short game. My playthrough of the game lasted about 4.5 hours until the credits rolled. Like I said before, Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 had two main characters with their own individual stories, so there's reason to go back and play through those games again to see different story elements and play as different people. But Resident Evil 3 combines Jill and Carlos into one story. Now the original game was like that as well, meaning it was also a bit shorter than other Resident Evil games, but you would think that Capcom would either want to maybe split the stories in two for replay value, or add in new areas to the Resident Evil 3 remake to extend the life of the game. And that's where things get pretty weird, because they did add in new areas to the remake, but they also removed areas from the original game. The original game featured a clock tower in a park setting that you spent a good chunk of time in, which is absent from the remake of the game and replaced with different areas. Now granted, I think some of the new areas are fine, and playing as Carlos in the hospital was one of my favorite moments in the games, but I think if Capcom would have kept in the original areas while adding in new ones, it would have extended the game life greatly. As I mentioned before, puzzles are dumbed down and removed as well, so it's not like you can spend a ton of time trying to figure out something or find a certain item. It all pretty much just happens. In the original Resident Evil 3 game, after completing the game, there was a Mercenaries mode that extended the life of the game, and featured the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure service members trying to survive Raccoon City in timed events, but this was also completely removed from Resident Evil 3 Remake. In lieu of this, Capcom included a new online game called Resident Evil Resistance. Now I've only played a few rounds of this, so I won't go into too much detail, but essentially it is a 4-on-1 game in which 4 characters are trying to escape from an area and one character plays as the Mastermind. The Mastermind wants to kill all the characters before they can escape before the time limit ends, and uses a card system to do things like lay down traps, place zombies, and so on. What's nice is when you're playing as the Mastermind, it's not all just about placing stuff, as you can actually take over some of the characters as playing them in real time like a zombie. Each of the characters and the Mastermind also have their own skills that can be leveled up and a skill tree, and using teamwork is essential, but I noticed a major issue with how Resistance plays. It plays exactly like the single player game in terms of movement and controls, albeit with a special ability that each character can use. Now of course that's fine, the game controls great like I said, but that's in the single player game. Now imagine you playing a Resident Evil game where zombies and dogs and traps are being placed in real time, along with environmental hazards, along with trying to help out your teammates, along with trying to find key items to get to the exit, all while being timed. Like, it just doesn't work out all that well. I'm going to sink some more time into it though, and maybe I'll end up liking it a bit more, and if I do, I'll do an update video, but it's just way too chaotic, and the Resident Evil control scheme doesn't really lend itself to this type of gameplay. Resident Evil 3 Remake is honestly one of the weirdest games I've ever reviewed, because I do love the core game. It's fun, it's gorgeous, it controls really well, but there's just not enough meat on its bones considering how short of a game it is. The package almost feels a bit rushed, which is strange considering the amount of time this game has been in development. I think some of the problem is just how good Capcom has been lately. And when you compare the amount of content you get in Resident Evil 2 to Resident Evil 3, it's really a night and day difference. The added online multiplayer isn't done well enough to extend the game, I feel, and Capcom just sort of missed an opportunity with the Resident Evil 3 remake. Maybe they could have split Jill and Carlos into two different stories. Maybe they could have kept all the original areas and added in the new ones as well. Maybe they could have done a lot of things to make it a more longer and satisfying single player experience, which is what Resident Evil fans want from their games. As it stands though, Resident Evil 3 is great, but just way too short, and I think at $60 it's just priced a bit too high for the amount of gameplay that you get. Alright, so those are my thoughts on the Resident Evil 3 remake. I was honestly surprised with just how short the game was. Yes, the original game was short, but you feel like Capcom would have done something to want to extend the life of the game, and that multiplayer gameplay that they added in with Resistance just doesn't extend the game enough, I feel. It's not what people play Resident Evil for. People like to play Resident Evil for single player, not for the online multiplayer aspect, and I think Capcom just really missed an opportunity with this. The core game is fantastic, and if you can pick it up at like a discounted price, I definitely recommend it. It's just way too short, and once you sort of get settled in with the adventure, it's all over, and that for me was the biggest disappointment. But let me know in the comments section down below what you think about the Resident Evil 3 remake. Have you picked up this game already? If so, have you been playing it? Have you already beat it? Because there's a good chance that you have. And what you thought about the Resistance multiplayer. And as always guys, thank you for checking out this video. I'm gonna be honest with you, I do not feel very well today. No, it's not a T virus or a C virus. For some reason, I threw up this morning, and I hate throwing up. I'm kind of like Jerry Seinfeld, where it's like a whole big to-do. So I'm about to go lay on the couch for the rest of the day, but I wanted to get this video out for you guys because I know a lot of you guys are interested in this game. So thank you for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to share it around. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.